The Easterlings were mostly men of cruel and evil kind, descendants of those who had served and worshipped Sauron before his overthrow at the end of the Second Age. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today I wanted to update and remake the Easterlings of Middle-earth video for you all, so we will explore the history of the Men of the East here today. I'll link some articles and videos that helped with the creation of today's video, and I hope you guys check them out. Thank you all so much for joining me today. It means a lot to me, as always, and I really appreciate it. Now, let's begin our tale. The Easterlings, or swarthy men, were people who had dark hair and eyes, who were broad, with darker shades of skin tones and complexions, being shorter in stature but with long and strong arms. These men were generally friendlier with dwarves and the dwarven language Khazul than they were with the elves and with their languages. In terms of their collective history, we start back after the awakening of men in Middle-earth, in Hildorian during the First Age. In the years after the awakening of men, the shadow and power of Morgoth would come to them, and while some resisted, some men served. The first men to come west into Beleriand were the three houses of the Edain, of whose descendants and relations would make up the men of the west, and many of the middlemen of the world. And they began entering Beleriand in 310 of the First Age. The Easterlings, or so they were the first to be called by that name, entered the lands later, having tarried east of the Ered for longer than the Edain before passing west. Now they came after Morgoth broke the siege of Angband, and at a time when Morgoth's forces started to sweep through Beleriand. Men and elves were in a weak place and needed allies. So in 463 of the First Age, by at least the time when the Easterlings came into that land, Maedhros of the House of Fëanor, whose wisdom in those days was ever set against defeating Morgoth and reclaiming his father's Silmarils, befriended the Easterlings, and those men swore loyalty to the elves, some truly and some falsely. Indeed, since he learned of them, Morgoth was ever tempting men to serve him, and while many did not flock to his banner, some did. In this, it's important not to generalize, for the Easterlings were not in and of themselves evil, but some either joined evil in hopes of riches or promises from Morgoth and later Sauron, for them only to be controlled by such things, or they were conquered by evil and were subjected to fight for that very evil or suffer worse fates. I think it is important to remember that not all Easterlings were evil. Indeed, we see this at this point in time during the First Age for the Easterling chief Bor and his sons Borlak, Borlad, and Borthand, and their following swore loyalty to Maedhros and Maedhros. And these men were faithful and stayed so to their elven friends. These men set the example of the honor that Easterlings should have. But another chieftain named Ulfang, and his sons Uldor, Ulfast, and Ulwarth, as well as their followers served Morgoth, and by the Dark Lord's designs, they feigned friendship and loyalty to Caranthir, another one of the sons of Fëanor. The Easterlings as a group dwelt in the eastern lands of Beleriand, thus not mending the divide of trust that the men of the Edain had with them, as they lived further west and were more shut in their own lands. After the quest for the Silmaril, Maedhros formed a union to repel Morgoth, since it was seen from that quest that he was assailable. Thus Maedhros and his elves, as well as the dwarves and Easterlings, sought to fight Morgoth's forces from the east, while at the same time the other elves of the Noldor, joined by the Edain and a few of the Sindar, attacked Morgoth's host from the west. But this battle, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, went terribly astray. In large part, this was due especially to the betrayal of Uldor and his Easterlings, whose forces turned against the Noldor of the east during the battle, and other Easterlings came, costing the forces of Maedhros a possible victory against Morgoth, as they were overrun by those who they had seen as allies. However, Bor, his sons, and followers remained faithful to the elves during the treachery of men, and so Bor earned the epithet the Faithful. Maedhros slew Uldor in single combat, while Bor and his sons slew the other two sons of Ulfang, and while Maedhros survived and retreated, Bor and his sons did not. Evil had victory that day in the hearts of men, and such evil was rewarded by Morgoth, but in a lesser kind than the reward that might have been expected. In 472 of the First Age, the Easterlings were sent into Hithlum and were shut in, and Morgoth let them pillage as they would, so long as they were out of the way of Morgoth's ambitions. And pillage they did, even as any elves left were taken from that land as slaves of Morgoth, and the House of Hador was denigrated. The once happy men who had lived there and were vassals of the House of Fingolfin were made servants or worse by the Easterlings who went there, and some, such as Iron, kin of Turin and Turambar, were forced into marriage. Children, such as Tur in 488, would be captured and made into servants of the Easterlings. And while Tur escaped thraldom of the Easterling chief Lorgan in 491, and Turin eventually returned to his land and brought vengeance against some of the Easterlings, such as the chieftain Broda in 495, Hithlum and Dorloman were never the same. The Easterlings would go on to fight in the War of Wrath on the side of their Dark Master Morgoth, but they would be defeated, fleeing back into eastern Middle-earth and avoiding penance to the Valar. But many Easterlings would not give up the worship of darkness, turning eventually their reverence to Sauron. Indeed, it seems to me that the Easterlings of the Second and Third Ages were the descendants of the Easterlings of the First Age, or were at least very similar in factional alliances and practices. They would go to places such as Rhûn in the Far East and make kingdoms there that were either willingly in the service of Sauron or would be forcibly in such service. During the Dark Years, Sauron urged men of the East to go west for conquest and loot, and indeed such men would be a hindrance to the Northmen of Rhovanion who fought against the Easterlings and Orcs. But it was truly after the War of the Elves and Sauron, when Sauron was pushed back into Mordor, that he truly turned his eyes east and dominated and subjugated the Easterlings, and the men of the South. Indeed, it had been during the War of the Elves and Sauron that Sauron recovered 9 rings from Eregion to give to men, and one of the 9 would be Khamûl, a king of the men of the East. And I imagine that Khamûl's thraldom to Sauron put the Easterlings under more control of the Dark Lord. By the time of the end of the Second Age and the beginning of the Third Age, the Easterlings, who had suffered another age-ending defeat in the War of the Last Alliance, hated Gondor, all the West, and they desired the riches of the West. While they scattered, being released from tyranny after the fall of Sauron, evil and darkness still remained in many of the hearts of the Easterlings. And that faction would become perhaps the greatest threat to Gondor throughout a majority of the Third Age, until the return of Sauron near the end of the Age. The Easterlings invaded Gondor from the northeast in 490 of the Third Age, being defeated by Roman-Dekil I, the East Victor, in 500. But Roman-Dekil was slain in battle in 541, to be avenged by his son Turambar of Gondor, who won much territory in the east for Gondor as that kingdom continued to expand. And while this caused the Easterlings to cease their attacks for some centuries, having been greatly defeated, they would return. Sometime around the year 1000, invaders from the east would come into northern Gondor and Rhovanion, harassing the people there and helping to cast a darkness for Sauron at that place and time, as he went into Dol Guldur, while he was still in hiding. In 1248, the power of the Easterlings had grown once again, and Gondor learned that not all of the Northmen of Rhovanion were true to Gondor, and some joined with the Easterlings. Although many of the Northmen were loyal to Gondor, and were given lands in South Rhovanion and helped stave off attacks from the Easterlings. And so the king Minalcar of Gondor led a mighty host, defeating a large army of Easterlings in between Rhovanion and the Sea of Rhûn, and they even destroyed their camps and settlements east of the Sea of Rhûn, expanding their victory far beyond Rhovanion. After this, Minalcar became Roman-Dekil II. Again, this victory against the east, while great, would not last forever, and after some emissaries of Sauron stirred up the men of the east, a new group of men came forth to harass Gondor, and these men were far better equipped than those who came before. These were the Wainriders, a people or confederacy of many peoples, who rode upon wains, and their chieftains upon chariots, and they attacked Gondor suddenly. In 1856, around the same time as when the Nazgûl re-entered Mordor, King Narmakil II was slain in the Battle of the Plains with the Wainriders, and eastern Gondor beyond Anduin, as well as northern Gondor and eastern and southern Rhovanion, suffered under these Wainriders. But Narmakil's son, Kelametar, aided by a revolt in Rhovanion against the Easterlings there, avenged his father in 1899. The Wainriders were driven out until 1944, when they passed south of Mordor, making alliances with the men of the south. And thus, while their allies attacked Gondor in the south, the Wainriders returned to battle with Gondor in the north, slaying King Andohir and both of his sons, Artamir and Faramir, and Minotaur, one of the captains of Gondor, as well as many of the Eothai that were with them. But Eärnil II defeated the Wainriders in the Battle of the Camp, even as they celebrated their victory over Gondor. After the defeat of the Wainriders and during the Watchful Peace, Sauron retreated east and kept his tyranny over the Easterlings strong. Thus, when the Balcoth, another group of Easterlings who were likely related to the Wainriders, came out of the east to overrun northern Gondor and Calanarthon, they were united and mighty. Gondor was in a very weak place at the time, and the Gondorian defenders of Calanarthon were nigh overrun, for the northern army of Gondor fought off orcs of the Misty Mountains, and the southern army of Gondor came and was weaker than the Balcoth army that had crossed Anduin and pushed them into the wold. Before the armies of Cirion the Steward were destroyed, and the Steward along with them, belated riders came out of the north and appeared on the field of Celebrant, and thus the Eotheid saved Gondor, unlooked for, during the battle of the field of Celebrant, crushing the Balcoth, and they were given the land of Calanarthon to dwell in, calling it Rohan. Finally, we come to the War of the Ring, where the Easterlings were one of the great supplementary forces of Sauron. Frodo and Sam witnessed men out of the East lands coming into Mordor, swelling the forces beyond the Black Gate. They would fight alongside the Haradrim and Variags in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, but mostly during the war, they once again threatened the north, when the Easterlings attacked the men and dwarves of the north during the Battle of Dale. They, led by a commander, chieftain, or even emperor of the Easterlings, pushed the armies of King Brand back from the Carnan River, to Dale, and then to the feet of Erebor, and the Easterlings had temporary victory, after slaying King Dane Ironfoot and King Brand. While the next kings, Thorin III Stonehelm and Bard II, were able to hold out against a siege from the Easterlings, the One Ring was destroyed in the south, and once Sauron was defeated, the Easterlings lost morale, and were pushed back into the east. Gandalf even said that if not for the defenders in the north, the west could not have prevailed against Sauron. And so we come to the Fourth Age, and without Morgoth and Sauron, and against the new lords of the western kingdoms, the Easterlings would never be able to hope for victory and conquest again. They would be subdued by King Elisar of the Reunited Kingdom and King Eomer of Rohan. It is my hope that the Easterlings were able to overcome the tyranny and evils that held sway over them for ages, becoming as honorable and good as the Easterlings of Bor and his sons, building great kingdoms of their own for the ages to come. Thus we come to the end of our tale about the Easterlings of Middle-earth. From the Easterlings of Middle-earth, we see that we must always remain honorable and true to our friends and ourselves, lest we succumb to any fell ambition that leads us astray. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections about the Easterlings? Let me know in the comments below. The Easterlings are definitely an interesting and complex group in the Legendarium, for they underwent events that were terrible in the East, being closer to the lands of Sauron, making them who they were over the ages. Indeed, no one is evil in the beginning, and this is most definitely true with the Easterlings. To further support the channel, please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and Patreon for a podcast and Discord server. All of those links are in the description below. I want to shout out our Valar tier patrons: Adrian De La Tour, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Samuel McBee, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scouten, and Tobias Goldner. Thank you guys so much, it means a lot to me. Finally, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I will see you all again next week with a video on what happened to the two blue wizards. Everyone, as always, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.